My long-distance boyfriend ghosted me, then convinced me to get back together and fly out to see him. He took me to his house, then kept me hostage with no food or water for 4 days. I was in a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend, Tim, until the day he blocked and ghosted me. For a month, I didn't hear from him. Then, out of the blue, he reached out, begging to get back together. He even sent me a plane ticket to visit him, and I gave in. When he picked me up from the airport, he asked if I wanted to get back together, and in the heat of the moment, I said yes. He drove me to his house, and as I was introducing myself to his parents, I got a notification about an incoming hurricane. The next morning, the hurricane started. Tim woke me up by shaking me and ordered me to come downstairs. When I did, I saw Tim, his 2 brothers, sister, and parents all sitting with a binder. Each of them took turns reading from it, explaining why Tim and I shouldn't be together. Then, Tim broke up with me. But that wasn't the worst of it. He said that because of the hurricane, I had to stay inside for safety, but since I wasn't family, I wouldn't be given any food, water, or even a bed. They claimed these essentials were reserved for family. The hurricane was supposed to last 4 days. That first night after the breakup felt like a nightmare. The storm outside was raging, and the wind howled so loudly that it echoed through the house. The windows rattled violently. Inside, though, was even worse. I had no choice but to sleep on the cold, hard floor in the living room. They didn't offer me a bed or even a blanket, so I used my jacket as a pillow and hugged myself to keep warm. Every time I moved, I felt the ache in my bones. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since the night before, and Tim had made it clear I wasn't allowed in the kitchen. I tried to wrap my mind around how things had come to this. How did the man who once told me he loved me now stand there, break up with me in front of his family, humiliate me, and leave me to starve? Despite my mind racing, I tried to sleep. I curled up, hugging my knees in a desperate attempt to stay warm, but it didn't help. There was no escaping the situation. I couldn't leave. I was trapped with these people who made it painfully clear I didn't belong. Just when I thought I might finally fall asleep, the hurricane outside roared louder than ever. A deafening gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows so hard I thought they might shatter. I jolted awake, my heart racing as the storm howled like a wild animal. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The cold bit into my skin, and fear crept back in. I lay there trembling, too cold, hurt, and angry to rest. By the second day, the reality of my situation hit hard. I woke up with a sore back from the floor and an emptiness in my stomach that I couldn't ignore. From the kitchen, I heard them laughing and chatting like everything was normal while I stayed out of sight in the living room. It was as if I didn't exist. Tim didn't even glance my way when he walked past to check the storm damage. By the afternoon, the hunger had become unbearable. I couldn't remember the last time I felt so desperate for food. My stomach twisted and knotted painfully, making it hard to think straight. I felt weak and lightheaded, and with every passing minute, the pain grew worse. I was too afraid to sneak into the kitchen, so I stayed hidden. But when Tim stepped away from the others to check his phone, I couldn't help myself. Cautiously, I approached him and begged for something, anything to eat. I told him I hadn't eaten and felt weak. He barely glanced at me, his eyes still glued to his phone. "I told you, you're not welcome here anymore," he muttered. I told him I was starving, just asking for enough to get through the day. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt on his face, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. He sighed, as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience, and told me I'd have to figure it out on my own. He reminded me that they needed their supplies for the storm. I stood there, stunned, feeling the sting of his words like a slap in the face. My mouth was dry, and my stomach clenched even harder, but there was nothing left to say. He turned his back on me and walked back to his family without another word. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I made the decision to sneak into the kitchen. I was terrified of getting caught, but I didn't have a choice. I needed to eat. I crept down the hallway as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of the wind and rain outside. When I got to the kitchen, I opened the pantry and grabbed a couple of cans, a can opener, and a bottle of water. My hands were shaking as I did it, and I felt like I was committing a crime. Just as I was about to leave, the floor creaked. I froze, holding my breath. After a few tense moments, I realized no one was coming. I hurried back to the living room, my heart still racing, and began to eat in silence. I sat in the dark, opening the can as quietly as possible. The metallic pop was deafening in the silence of the house. I ate quickly, barely tasting it. It was the most miserable meal of my life, baked beans and a can of cold chicken soup. The water felt like a blessing. Every moment, I feared being caught. When I finished, I knew I couldn't leave the evidence. If anyone saw the empty cans or bottle, it would make things worse. So I gathered everything up and crept down the hallway. The kitchen trash can was too risky. Instead, I carefully pushed the back door open, feeling the wind from the storm still howling outside, and slipped into the yard. The ground was soaked, and the rain fell in a steady drizzle, but I didn't care. I crouched down by the side of the house, behind some bushes, and buried the cans and bottle beneath leaves and mud. I wiped my hands on my pants and tried to calm my racing heart before heading back inside. The wind roared, and for a moment, I stood there in the dark, feeling the cold rain on my skin. When I finally went back in, even though I had to sleep on the cold living room floor again that night, I felt a little better with a full stomach. The next morning, I tried to stay out of sight. I didn't want to deal with Tim or his family, and I certainly didn't want them to see me like this. But around midday, I was caught. Tim's sister saw me sneaking back from the kitchen with one of the cans I had taken the night before. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me. I could feel humiliation burning in my cheeks. Later, when no one else was around, she slipped me a small packet of crackers and whispered, "Don't let them see you take anything else." It was a tiny act of kindness, but in that moment, it felt like the world. She also told me I could come to her room if I needed essentials, as long as no one else saw. I muttered a quick thank you before she walked away. Despite her help, I still felt completely isolated. I knew she wasn't on my side. None of them were. And even though she gave me the crackers, it didn't make up for the fact that I had been essentially abandoned in this house. On the third day, the storm was still going, but it had calmed enough for me to step outside briefly. I needed fresh air to break the suffocating atmosphere inside. The sky was dark, and the wind still harsh, but it was better than staying cooped up in the living room. I walked around the yard, trying to clear my head and figure out what I would do once the storm passed. There was no way I could stay here any longer. When I went back inside, I thought I was in the clear. But as soon as I walked through the door, I saw Tim in the kitchen. His back was turned. I glanced down the hall at his sister's room. Earlier, I'd noticed her door had been left slightly ajar, and I made a plan. I would sneak in and see if she had anything useful I could take without getting caught. Carefully, I moved down the hallway past the kitchen, my heart pounding as I inched closer to her room. Tim's voice echoed faintly, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. I was too preoccupied with getting what I needed and getting out without being seen. My hands were shaking as I gently pushed the door open wider and stepped into her room as quietly as I could. My eyes darted to the bedside table, then to the small dresser, but I didn't see anything useful. I could feel panic rising again. But then, near the closet, I spotted a small stash of food, probably some canned goods she'd set aside for herself, along with a thick folded blanket. I grabbed a couple of the cans, tucking them under my arm, and then I took the blanket. It was soft, heavier than anything I had in the living room, and I clutched it to my chest. Carefully, I made my way back down the hall. When I reached the living room, I crouched down beside the couch and discreetly slid the cans and blanket underneath it, hiding them from view. I planned to come back for them later, once everyone was asleep. Later, when the house was quiet and the storm outside drowned out the sound of my movements, I would finally have something to eat. Just as I was getting up from behind the couch, Tim asked what I was doing. I said I thought I had dropped my earring, but I found it. He looked at me suspiciously, and before he could say anything, his sister came to the rescue. She said their parents needed him for something that instant, and he left. I breathed a sigh of relief. Later that night, as I was silently eating the food I had gotten from Tim's sister, Tim came into the living room. I didn't hear his footsteps over the sound of my own eating. He saw me with one of the cans of soup I'd taken earlier, and I could immediately tell by the look on his face that things were about to get bad. He asked what I was doing, and I froze. the can of soup still in my hand. He said that it was their food and I wasn't allowed to take whatever I wanted. He said they needed it for the storm. I tried to explain that I hadn't eaten and that I didn't have a choice. He told me I had a choice, and I made it. He said I should have respected the fact that they were nice enough to give me shelter during the storm after the breakup, and that stealing their food was crossing the line. They had a pantry full of food that would have lasted them well after the storm had passed, yet he still seemed mad. He called me selfish, saying I was taking from his family when they had already been stretched thin from the hurricane. I told him there was plenty of food to go around and that he was just treating me like this out of spite. I couldn't take it anymore. I could feel the tears forming in my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of him. The next morning, I told him I was leaving. He said I should have left the minute I knew things were over. I stayed up all night in fear of what he might do to me now that he knew I had eaten their food. The next morning, the hurricane had finally calmed down enough for me to leave. I booked the first flight I could find and packed my things. I didn't say goodbye to Tim or his family. I just grabbed my stuff and got out of there as fast as I could. I couldn't believe what had happened. It felt like I was escaping from a prison. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few weeks after I got back to New York, Tim showed up at my office. I was at work, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me, when I saw him walk in. He had this smug smile on his face, like nothing had happened. I couldn't believe the audacity. He walked up to my desk and started talking like we were still on good terms. He said he'd been thinking things over and wanted to try again, to clear the slate between me and him. I was speechless. How could he even think I'd want to be with him after everything he'd put me through? After what he and his family had done, I told him to leave, but he kept going on, talking about how he'd made a mistake and how we should give things another shot. Eventually, one of my coworkers noticed what was going on and called security. They escorted him out of the building, but I was still shaking by the time he was gone. I couldn't believe how delusional he was. That was the last time I ever saw Tim. I blocked his number, deleted him from all my social media, and moved on with my life. Looking back, I can't believe I ever gave him a second chance. But if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Conclusion. In the end, I realized how blind I had been to Tim's true nature. What started as a hopeful reunion quickly turned into a nightmare, leaving me trapped in a place where I was humiliated, neglected, and stripped of my dignity. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, believing in the love we once shared, but that trust was shattered when I saw how easily he and his family turned against me. They had shown me cruelty under the guise of hospitality, and by the time I escaped, I knew I could never go back. Tim's unexpected visit to my office made me see how delusional he really was, thinking he could simply undo everything he had done. But by then, I had learned a valuable lesson. When people reveal their true selves, there is no room for second chances. I finally understood my worth, and in doing so, I found the strength to cut him out of my life for good. Moving forward, I knew that I deserved better, and I vowed never to let anyone diminish me again. Thank you very much for watching to the story so far. I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss tomorrow's stories.